In this lesson, we'll be taking a look at probably the most integral aspect of any argument and one of the more frequently occurring critical reasoning questions that you'll find on the GMAT, questions that ask you to identify an assumption. So let's begin just by recapping the logistics for critical reasonings on the exam. We know that they are likely to be the least frequently occurring question type. There's going to be approximately 10 of the 36 questions in the verbal section that are critical reasonings. And usually you're going to have about 80% of those 10 or so that will be argument tasks, and about 20% that are inference or what must be true style tasks. Now, strategically, we know that we want to assume about 2 minutes per question as an average for critical reasoning. You're going to have a maximum of 3 minutes for any critical reasoning. You're going to want to note the task of the question before you engage the paragraph prompt. You're going to want to limit yourself to a single reread before you move to just eliminating and guessing, because it can take you a bit of time if you keep going back to that prompt. You want to take targeted notes to proactively address your specific question task, in this case, to identify an assumption. And these are the primary question format to guess and skip if you're behind pace after question 12 or question 24 as you split your verbal section into thirds for tracking. Now, to recognize and identify an assumption task. Well, first, recognize the reference to an argument or recommendation in the question step. You'll also see some specific terms such as assumption, assumes, or depends, indicating an assumption task. And you have to be careful of considering assumption tasks as equivalent to strengthen. With an assumption task, you're not simply asking for something that would help you believe the argument is true. You are looking for something that is actually necessary to believe that this argument is valid. So strategically, you want to closely note the details of the argument when you have assumption tasks specifically. Note that extremes can be necessary assumptions. So when you see absolute terms, superlatives, alls, nones, while that may seem like a reason to eliminate because it goes so far, because assumptions are necessary, you actually, in many cases, for assumption tasks, want to make sure that you catch that these things may need to be necessary. Now, you're going to need to categorically identify the type of argument to broadly predict possible assumptions. And you're going to want to use what we call the negation test if you get down to 2 or 3 possible answer choices. And we'll do that in an example here later in this lesson. Recognize that some wrong answers as de facto task reversals will go too far about what is necessary. You'll say that actually doesn't need to be true. If it's not true, and this gets back to the negation test, doesn't make the argument categorically fail. And of course, you can eliminate more quickly if a choice proactively matches your prediction of what the assumption should be. So we revisit the argumentation equation because the assumption is going to be a big part of this. Of course, our conclusion is going to be what all arguments lead up to, your subjective opinion that is explicitly stated that requires some sort of support. That support comes from your premise, which is going to be the objective facts that are explicitly providing support. And the piece that is most important in the argument and what we are addressing with this type of task is going to be the assumption directly, which is going to be the implied unstated facts that must be true to link the premise to the conclusion logically. So how do we identify assumptions in an argument? Well, first, you want to try to predict specifically, based on the type of argument, what must unassailably be true to reasonably believe the conclusion based on the given premise. So the assumption doesn't just strengthen the argument again. It's something that is required by the argument for it to make any logical sense. And you can properly categorize your argument to help focus on details that may indicate leaps in logic that you might be overlooking. Because our brain does that. It tries to make sense of things. And you need to make sure you don't go too quickly and focus on those details, term shifts, that sort of thing, that may indicate a potential leap in logic that is an assumption that may be unwarranted. So our common argument assumptions, we know an analogy means that the items in the premise and the conclusion are relevant and comparable in relevant ways. So we can see that the assumption is just that they are comparable. So if you've got an argument based on an analogy, the assumption is that they're comparable in whatever the relevant fashion is. For representation arguments, your assumption is that the evidentiary sample is representative of the larger whole. So whatever they're saying in the premise represents the whole of the conclusion. When you have data and evidence interpretation, your assumption is that there is no other reasonable interpretation of that data or evidence. For a causality, there are no other possible causes or outcomes, and the circumstance isn't just a coincidence. And for plan or recommendation based arguments, you assume that you're going to execute the argument or the plan or recommendation, and whatever that plan or recommendation is will work and is ultimately necessary to accomplish the goal of what they are offering as the metric of success. So let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning assumption task. So as always, we start with the question stem, not the paragraph. Which of the following is an assumption that the argument requires? And of course, we can see the term assumption, so this is clearly an identify an assumption task. Then we'll read the paragraph prompt from the beginning. Agriculturally, few resources are as valuable as fertile topsoil. However, one of the most prolific North American crops, corn, depletes this resource at a rate of 2 bushels of topsoil eroded for every bushel of corn harvested. Therefore, corn production in North America should be phased out in favor of crops that are less detrimental to topsoil. So we see the term should, which indicates a recommendation. So we now know what our common argument type is going to be for this argument. It is a plan or recommendation, which is going to inform our stock assumption. So our conclusion is the plan that's being offered and that it's going to be executed. So we know that our prediction should be to find something that must be true to believe that this plan to phase out corn production is necessary and will ultimately work to save the topsoil. So we introduce the answer choices, and as always, we'll process of eliminate for common wrong reasons, starting with vague impacts. And if we look at choice B, we see a big old can, and topsoil composition can vary greatly from one region to another. This could not be more vague if it tried. We don't know if this region is North America. We don't know what those variances are. We don't know what the composition of topsoil means. So vague, or you could categorize this as additional information. And we've got some other answer choices that are going to require additional information as well, such as corn is an integral part of most American diets. Okay, well, we don't know anything about the diets. We don't know if it could be replaced, if it's something that people like, dislike, so that requires additional information. And we also can have some task reversals. And task reversals here are a little bit different. Things that should not be true, that weaken the argument, are going to be not wanted as assumptions. So very few crops are as prolific as corn. Well, now we're saying that corn is something that grows well. And if corn grows well, that may be a fact in favor of corn being produced as opposed to phasing it out, even though the topsoil is being eroded. So we can get rid of choice D because it's something that we don't want to be true. Another type of task reversal is going to be something that doesn't need explicitly to be true for assumptions. So erosion is the single biggest threat to topsoil in North America. Well, we don't need it to be the worst threat to topsoil. So that would go too far and isn't something that needs to be true. Now, if we look at choice C, however, fertile topsoil is an exhaustible resource. Well, this is the entire crux of the argument. We're saying that the topsoil corn is detrimental to it. And so if the topsoil is exhaustible, then we want to save it. However, if the topsoil were not exhaustible, we don't need to do this plan at all because it's an inexhaustible resource. And even though it erodes, it apparently keeps coming back. And our correct answer would be C. And this leads into the idea, as we were thinking through this choice, of the extra device you can use to work through assumptions. And that, of course, is going to be the negation test for assumptions. So step one for the negation test is to work the problem as normal, reaching 2 or 3 options by eliminating choices proactively against your prediction. So we don't want to negate everything in our answer choice. And you could see in that previous problem, I don't think that you necessarily would need to test the choices using the negation test. It's relatively straightforward to eliminate for our other common wrong reasons. So don't go straight to the negation test. Work the problem normally, eliminate choices for common wrong reasons. But then you want to take a remaining answer choice and negate its impact by adding or removing the word not, or by applying a technically opposing quantity. So literally making it the opposite. And it's important to note that the opposite of rich is not poor. The opposite of rich is not rich. And you have to make sure you don't go from one extreme to the other. And we'll talk about that on the next slide here in a moment. Technically, negating quantities is a little bit trickier. It doesn't happen all that much on this exam, but you can always just apply a not to the main verb. And Then we've got step 3, which is to apply the negated information from your now negated choice to determine the impact of that negation on the viability of the conclusion. And if nothing happens to the argument or the argument strengthens upon negating the choice's information, you can eliminate that choice as not necessary for the conclusion. Because when you took the information away, you went, okay, the argument's still valid. But if the argument fails upon applying the negation of the choice, you need to select that choice as your negated fail, because it's saying that when this choice is not true, the argument doesn't work. So therefore, the choice is necessary to believe the conclusion is valid. So let's go take a look at an example in a moment after we consider our technical quantities. First, we understand that the word all means as a percent, 100%. And we just covered that the opposite of rich isn't poor, so the opposite of all technically is not none. The opposite of all is going to be not all, or less than 100%, because anything that is less than 100% is not going to qualify as all. Similarly, we know that most is going to be greater than 50%. And the opposing quantity here is not going to be least. It's actually going to be not most. So something that is less than or equal to 50%. Now, some means greater than 0%. So that means that there's something that exists. Can be any quantity. And your opposition here is actually a defined percentage. It's none. So 0%. And the reason that this matters is if we consider the statement, some dogs walk on 4 legs. You go, yes, that's true. And most dogs walk on 4 legs, but not all dogs walk on 4 legs, unfortunately. Now, if, however, we consider a slight variation on that, all 3 of the statements are going to be true, even though they're not how you'd consider them. All dogs breathe oxygen. Yes, 100% of dogs breathe oxygen. So too do most dogs breathe oxygen, because more than 50%, 100% breathe oxygen. And some dogs, too, breathe oxygen. So you can see it's a weird technicality, but you have to apply these exact oppositional percentage concepts if you're going to oppose an all, a most, or a some. So let's take a look at another example. So as always, we go and read the task first. So which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So we've got assumption, we've got the word depends here, so we recognize the key terms indicating that this is an assumption task. We then read the paragraph. For a decade, annual surveys have provided regular information about the Donderonia hospital system, and those surveys have consistently shown that urban hospitals experience a much higher inpatient mortality rate than rural ones do. This clearly shows that Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts. So, what is the evidence? It's some surveys. So that means that we are looking at a representative sample, that from the information of the surveys, we're making this conclusion. Of course, we'll note the explicit conclusion, which is that Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts. And we'll predict our categorical assumption based on the way a representative sample argument works. So that would be there is no other info to reinterpret the data, and there is no other possible cause for the higher mortality rate at urban hospitals than that they are run more poorly than rural hospitals. So we're ultimately trying to find a reason that the rural hospitals may not be run more poorly based solely on this one metric of a higher inpatient mortality rate. So we introduce the answer choices as always, and we're going to look for common wrong argumentation reasons, and we'll potentially use the negation test. So we start with vague impacts, and we can see outpatient procedures are more common in Donderonia than are inpatient procedures. And you go, okay, more common. Like 1 more, 1,000,000 more. There's a whole lot of variance that can happen here. And we also probably would say that this needs additional information as well. So choice E we can get rid of pretty directly. Similarly with choice B, talking about Donderonia hospitals being inferior to those of the neighboring nations, I know nothing about the neighboring nations. And that doesn't clarify whether it's rural or urban hospitals. So choice B is out as well. And the diets of rural citizens vary greatly. That too introduces an entirely new variable that we need a bunch of information about. Now, choice A and C specifically are addressing urban environments or hospitals. So we may not see a task reversal in either of these. And we may actually need to apply that negation test. So let's do that with choice A first. Urban hospitals usually do not admit thousands more patients per hospital than do rural hospitals. And we go, okay, well, when I was considering this in the affirmative, maybe we just go, maybe that's relevant that the urban hospitals need to admit thousands more because that's how they end up with higher mortality rate or something of that nature. But when we apply the negation, it should be clear that this is not necessary because the rural hospitals could be run better than the urban ones based on the evidence provided without the urban hospitals admitting thousands more patients per month. So this is what we would call a negated no impact. It does not affect our argument whatsoever, so we can eliminate choice A. Now, choice C says urban environments in Donderonia are not suffering from a fatal drug overdose epidemic. So this, we just cross out the not. And that's usually how you can affect a really simple negation test on the exam, is just go in and eliminate the not from the main verb or add the word not to the main verb. And if we said urban environments in Donderonia are suffering from a fatal drug overdose epidemic, you might think to yourself, well, that doesn't matter. But if we have a fatal drug overdose epidemic, this does provide another reason that the Donderonia urban hospitals might experience a much higher inpatient mortality rate. We've got drug overdoses that it seemingly are not necessarily occurring in the rural areas, and that would attack the argument directly because now I'm not necessarily saying that the rural hospitals will run better. I'm saying that Donderoni has just got a different problem, and that shows that there's not. And this basically gives the additional information to reinterpret that data about the inpatient mortality rate that it's caused by this drug epidemic, not poorly run hospitals. So we select C as our necessary assumption. So how do we work through a standard identify and assumption task? As always, we need to identify the task by recognizing those key indicator terms in the presence of an argument with a main conclusion. You'll want to read that prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and note the explicit conclusion of that argument. Then, if you have a common argument that has been identified, more specifically predict what a categorical assumption in the argument may be based on that premise. But if no common argument is identified, you could just use a generic prediction to find what must be true to believe the conclusion that ... whatever the conclusion is. And lastly, of course, eliminate your choices against the prediction using the common wrong answer reasons and apply the negation test as you find it to be needed for the final 2 to 3 options. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example to see how you'll execute with your scratch work when you are addressing assumption tasks on critical reasoning questions on the GMAT. So here we have a sample critical reasoning style question for the exam. And we've got A, B, C, D, E, and we put a little line over top for our potential task. And we start with which of the following is an assumption upon which the conductor's argument depends. So we can clearly see we need to find an assumption. So this is an assumption task. And we just write out assumption. So then we're just going to put PA up here for predicted assumption, and we'll start by reading the paragraph. So we, of course, have a claimed conductor. The cost of assembling a professional orchestra keeps all but the largest cities from having a symphony in residence. However, the value of a symphony to its community is priceless for the inspiration it provides to listeners of all ages. A smaller city could reap these benefits only by soliciting the largesse of wealthy philanthropists, but the efforts would surely be rewarded. So we've got a theoretical plan from this acclaimed conductor. And so our predicted assumption is just going to be what must be to believe that the plan to solicit, and we'll just call them WPs for wealthy philanthropists, will work and is necessary for small cities to benefit from a community symphony. So we just got to find something that must be true to believe that, yeah, we need to have a wealthy philanthropist. That's the only way for these small cities to benefit from a community symphony. So all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians. So we're at least talking about the relevant pieces here. And at worst, I'd probably hold this with our little tilde because we're like, okay, we see the word inspiration up here. We've got professionals. We've got symphony all over the place. So we're at least using the right terms. There's no term shift. Now, some quality symphonies are comprised entirely of amateurs. Well, this too, we've got quality symphonies. And again, this is getting a little bit different because I don't see what quality means, but we see that it's at least talking about symphonies, and professionals and amateurs are kind of oppositional. So we'll hold that too for a moment. Now, many large cities without symphonies desire to have one. Well, we're talking about small cities, and this has really nothing to do with our assumption. At the very best, this is going to need additional info because we don't know how that is going to impact our conclusion about the small cities benefiting. Now, young listeners tend to care less for classical music than listeners of other demographics. Well, while this is the kind of thing our brain may assume, there's nothing in the argument about young listeners. It says listeners of all ages, but we don't care to call out specifically young listeners, at least according to the argument. So that too would require additional information, and we can eliminate choice D. And then a number of philanthropists wealthy enough to support a symphony reside in smaller cities. Well, a number. What number? Is it one? Does this person want to give to a symphony? I have more questions than answers from choice E, so that too can be eliminated for needing additional information. So then we can apply our negation test and we can think about our technical qualities because, or our technical quantities, that is. So if we're looking at choices A and B, let's start with choice A. We know that the opposite of all is not none, it's not all. So let's just put a little not over here. And we say not all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians. Well, the conductor's argument is actually predicated on the idea that the cost of a professional orchestra is what's keeping all but the largest cities, so anything that's not a large city, i.e., small cities, can't have a symphony in residence. But if choice A is true, then we could have non professional symphonies. And if we have non professional symphonies, they might be able to give the priceless inspiration, because not all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians, without the plan. So this is going to be what is called a negated fail. Whereas if we take a look at choice B, we know that the technically opposing quantity to some is in fact none. And we say no quality symphonies, as negation, are comprised entirely of amateurs. Okay, so no quality symphonies are comprised entirely of amateurs. Well, we don't need to say that that's completely, not possible, because saying that they're not comprised entirely of amateurs, well, honestly, that makes it seem like this argument's getting better because now it seems like we can't go get amateur people. We need professional people, and it's professional people that need to be paid by the wealthy philanthropists in this conductor's argument. So this is going to be a negated strengthen, which is, again, the opposite of what the correct answer should do upon negation, because we don't want the removal of the assumption to make the argument stronger. We want the removal of the assumption to make the argument fail. So go ahead and practice some assumption tasks on your own, as your improvement on performance for these specific tasks should help with every other argument task as well.